In 1991, an entire family vanished without a trace in the Oregon wilderness. 12 years later, a lumberjack made a discovery that defied every law of logic and time itself. What he found in that remote cabin wasn't just evidence of the missing family. It was proof that someone or something had been keeping track of every single day since their disappearance. Before we dive into this mind-bending case, hit that subscribe button, because you're about to hear something that will change how you think about missing persons cases forever. My name is Detective Sarah Chen, and I've spent the last 15 years investigating cold cases that most people have forgotten. But there's one case that haunts me more than any other: the disappearance of the Borges family in the summer of 1991. I wasn't the original investigator, but when new evidence surfaced in 2003, I inherited a file that would consume my thoughts for years to come. The Borges family seemed to live the perfect American dream. Marcus Borges, a 42-year-old architect from Portland, had built his career designing eco-friendly homes that blended seamlessly with nature. His wife, Elena, a 38-year-old freelance photographer, specialized in capturing the raw beauty of the Pacific Northwest wilderness. Their twin daughters, Sophia and Carmen, were bright 14-year-olds who shared their parents' love for outdoor adventures. The family had a tradition of spending their summer vacations completely off-grid, away from phones, televisions, and the constant buzz of city life. In June 1991, they rented a remote cabin near the Cascade Range, about 60 miles southeast of Portland. The property was owned by an elderly man named Harold Voss, who had inherited the land from his grandfather. The cabin sat on 200 acres of dense forest, accessible only by a winding dirt road that became treacherous during winter months. Voss rarely visited the property himself, preferring to rent it out to families seeking isolation and tranquility. The Borges family had stayed there twice before, in 1989 and 1990, and had fallen in love with the pristine wilderness and complete solitude. Elena's photography equipment filled half their SUV: cameras, tripods, portable darkroom supplies, and dozens of rolls of film. She was working on a coffee table book about Oregon's hidden natural wonders and saw this trip as an opportunity to capture some of her best work. Marcus brought his sketch pads and drafting tools, planning to design their dream retirement home while surrounded by the inspiration of towering Douglas firs and babbling creeks. The twins packed their journals, art supplies, and a collection of mystery novels they'd been saving for the perfect reading atmosphere. They left Portland on June 15th, telling friends and neighbors they'd return on July 1st, refreshed and reconnected as a family. The cabin itself was a modest but well-maintained structure built in the 1940s. It featured 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen with a wood-burning stove, a cozy living area with a stone fireplace, and a wrap-around porch that offered stunning views of the surrounding forest. There was no electricity, no running water, and certainly no cell phone reception. The family would pump water from a well, cook over the wood stove, and spend their evenings reading by oil lamp and candlelight. For the Borges family, this wasn't roughing it, it was paradise. Harold Voss had given them detailed instructions about the property during their previous visits. The generator in the shed could provide limited electricity if needed, though they preferred not to use it. The propane tanks for the cooking stove were full, and there was enough split firewood to last well beyond their planned stay. The nearest neighbor was over 10 miles away, and the closest town, Cedar Falls, was a 30-minute drive on winding mountain roads. Voss had emphasized that if they encountered any problems, they should drive to town immediately rather than try to solve them alone. On June 14th, the day before their departure, Eleanor called her sister Maria to confirm their plans. She was excited about some new photography techniques she wanted to try and mentioned that Marcus had been sketching ideas for a cabin of their own. The twins had been counting down the days, eager to escape the pressure of final exams and summer reading assignments. Elena promised to call Maria from town when they returned, as had become their tradition after each wilderness retreat. It was the last conversation anyone would have with any member of the Borges family. Their friends knew not to expect contact during the vacation. The Borges family was famous for their complete digital detoxes during these trips. No one thought anything unusual when July 1st came and went without word. Elena's sister Maria began to worry on July 3rd, but assumed they had simply extended their stay by a few days. By July 8th, when Elena failed to show up for a pre-scheduled meeting with her publisher, Maria's concern turned to genuine alarm. The first call went to Harold Voss, who hadn't heard from his tenants since they'd picked up the keys. Voss lived in Salem, about 90 miles from the cabin, and admitted he rarely checked on his remote property during rental periods. He agreed to drive up and take a look, though the journey would take him most of the day. Maria also contacted the Clackamas County Sheriff's Department, though they initially treated it as a routine welfare check rather than a missing persons case. Deputy Robert Mills was the first law enforcement officer to reach the cabin on July 9th. What he found defied explanation. The family's blue Ford Explorer was parked exactly where it should be, unlocked with no signs of damage or disturbance. Inside the cabin, their belongings were arranged as if they had simply stepped out for a walk. Elena's cameras sat on the kitchen table, several with partially used rolls of film still inside. Marcus's sketches were spread across the dining table, weighted down by a coffee mug that still contained the dried remnants of what appeared to be morning coffee. The twins' journals lay open on their beds, with entries dated June 28th, the day before they were scheduled to leave. Sophia had written about hearing strange bird calls during the night, while Carmen described a dream about getting lost in a forest that grew darker and denser with each step. Their mystery novels were bookmarked partway through, reading glasses still folded inside the pages. In the kitchen, the wood stove was cold, but there were signs that a meal had been prepared recently. Dishes in the wash basin, crumbs on the cutting board, and a cast-iron skillet with traces of scrambled eggs. Deputy Mills found no signs of struggle, no evidence of violence, and no indication that the family had packed for departure. Their clothes remained folded in drawers, toiletries lined the bathroom shelf, and Elena's expensive camera equipment sat untouched. The cabin's door had been unlocked, which wasn't unusual for such a remote location, but there were no signs of forced entry or disturbance. It was as if 4 people had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind a perfectly preserved snapshot of their final morning. Harold Voss arrived later that afternoon and confirmed that nothing seemed to be missing from the cabin. The propane tanks were nearly empty, suggesting the family had been there for their full planned duration. The firewood supply was significantly depleted, and there were cold ashes in the fireplace, indicating recent use. Voss noticed that his guest logbook, which he kept on the mantelpiece for visitors to sign, contained an entry from the Borges family dated June 16th, the day after their arrival. Eleanor had written, "Paradise found again. The girls are already planning our next visit. M working on something special." By July 12th, the Clackamas County Sheriff's Department had launched a full-scale search operation. Search and rescue teams combed the surrounding forest for 3 days, covering a radius of 15 miles from the cabin. They found no trace of the family, no clothing, no footprints, no evidence that they had ever left the immediate area around the cabin. Search dogs picked up the family's scent inside the cabin and around the immediate yard, but the trail went cold just beyond the tree line. The case quickly attracted media attention. The Oregonian ran front-page stories about the vanished family, and television news crews set up camp in Cedar Falls. Local residents were interviewed repeatedly, but none recalled seeing the Borges family after their arrival on June 15th. The story had all the elements that capture public imagination: a successful, attractive family, a mysterious disappearance, and a setting that seemed both beautiful and somehow ominous. Detective Frank Morrison, who led the initial investigation, explored every possible theory. Had the family encountered wild animals? The Oregon wilderness was home to black bears and mountain lions, but attacks on groups of 4 people were virtually unheard of, and there was no evidence of animal involvement. Could they have become lost during a hiking expedition? Their hiking boots and outdoor gear remained in the cabin, and the family had never ventured far from the property during previous visits. Morrison investigated the possibility of foul play, but the evidence didn't support it. There were no signs of struggle, no indication that anything valuable had been taken, and no known enemies or threats against the family. The Borges family lived a quiet, middle-class life, with no involvement in criminal activity or dangerous relationships. Marcus's architectural firm was successful, but not controversial, and Elena's photography work focused on landscapes rather than investigative subjects that might have made her enemies. The detective also considered the possibility that the family had staged their own disappearance, though this theory seemed unlikely given the circumstances. Their financial situation was stable, there were no pending legal problems, and they had made concrete plans for activities after their return. Elena's publisher was expecting to receive completed photographs for her book, and Marcus had scheduled meetings with potential clients. The twins were enrolled in summer programs that would begin in mid-July. As weeks turned to months, the case began to fade from public attention. The search operation was scaled back, then eventually suspended. Detective Morrison continued working the case part-time, following up on occasional tips and reported sightings, but none led to concrete evidence. The Borges family joined the thousands of Americans who disappear each year without explanation, leaving behind grieving relatives and unanswered questions. Elena's sister Maria became the unofficial keeper of the family's memory, organizing annual vigils and maintaining contact with law enforcement. She refused to have them declared legally dead, holding on to hope that they might someday return with an explanation for their disappearance. The cabin was eventually cleaned out and returned to Harold Voss, who struggled to find new renters willing to stay in a place associated with such a disturbing mystery. By 1995, the case file had been moved to the Cold Case Division. Detective Morrison retired in 1998, taking with him a lingering sense of failure about the investigation he'd never been able to solve. The Borges family became a local legend, the subject of campfire stories and internet conspiracy theories. Some claimed they had been abducted by aliens. Others suggested they had discovered something in the forest that someone wanted to keep secret. A few insisted they had voluntarily disappeared to start new lives under assumed identities. I first encountered the Borges case in 2002, shortly after joining the Cold Case Unit. Detective Morrison's meticulously organized files painted a picture of a thorough investigation that had simply run out of leads. I read witness statements, studied crime scene photographs, and reviewed search operation reports. Like Morrison, I found myself drawn to the case's central mystery. How does an entire family vanish without leaving any trace of where they went or what happened to them? For months, I revisited the case files whenever I had spare time between active investigations. I drove to the cabin site, which Voss had eventually sold to a development company. The new owners had built a luxury vacation home where the original cabin once stood, erasing most physical traces of the Borges family's last known location. I interviewed longtime residents of Cedar Falls, hoping someone might remember a detail that had been overlooked during the original investigation. In November 2002, I received a call that would change everything. Tom Bradley, a commercial logger who worked in the Cascade Range, had been cutting timber on private land about 8 miles northwest of where the original cabin had stood. While clearing a section of old-growth forest, he had discovered something that didn't belong, a small log cabin, apparently built decades earlier, hidden so deep in the woods that it didn't appear on any maps or property records. Bradley was an experienced outdoorsman who had worked in Oregon forests for over 20 years. He knew the area well and was certain this cabin hadn't been there during his previous logging operations in the early 1990s. But what really caught his attention wasn't the cabin itself. It was the thin column of smoke rising from its chimney on a cold November morning, and the sound of someone moving around inside. I arrived at the site on November 15th, 2002, accompanied by Deputy Sheriff Kate Rodriguez and Tom Bradley. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering Douglas firs, accessible only by a narrow deer path that was barely visible from the logging road. The structure was crude but functional, built from local timber with a cedar shake roof and a stone chimney. Someone had clearly been living there recently. There was fresh firewood stacked on the porch, and the windows had been covered with newspaper to block outside view. What we found inside defied every logical explanation I could imagine. The cabin's single room contained basic furniture, a rough wooden table, 2 chairs, a single bed, and shelves lined with supplies. But it was the wall calendar that stopped me cold. Someone had been meticulously marking off each day since July 1991, over 11 years of careful record-keeping that tracked every single day since the Borges family's disappearance. The calendar itself was a cheap promotional item from a local auto parts store, the kind businesses give away at the end of each year. But this one covered multiple years, with pages carefully taped together to create a continuous timeline. Each day was marked with a small X in red pen, including weekends and holidays. Some dates had additional notations written in a cramped, barely legible handwriting that I would later learn to decipher. On the table, I found several notebooks filled with the same handwriting. The entries were disjointed and often incomprehensible, but certain themes emerged. There were references to keeping watch, waiting for the signal, and protecting the secret. Some pages contained detailed observations about wildlife movements, weather patterns, and the activities of loggers and hunters in the surrounding area. Other entries were more disturbing. Rambling paragraphs about voices in the forest, warnings about strangers, and repeated references to the family that couldn't leave. Deputy Rodriguez discovered a wooden crate filled with personal items that made my heart race. There was a child's bracelet engraved with the name Carmen, a man's wallet containing Marcus Borges' driver's license, and a small photo album filled with pictures I recognized from the original case file. The photographs showed the Borges family during what appeared to be their final vacation, images of the twins reading on the cabin porch, Marcus sketching by the fireplace, and Elena setting up her camera equipment in the forest. But the most chilling discovery was a collection of Polaroid photographs that seemed to document the family's final days. Unlike Elena's professional photography, these were crude snapshots that appeared to have been taken secretly from a distance. They showed the family going about their daily activities, cooking meals, reading, walking around the cabin. But there was something voyeuristic and unsettling about the images. In several photos, one or more family members appeared to be looking directly toward the camera, as if they had sensed they were being watched. I found evidence that someone had been living in this cabin recently. There were fresh food supplies, recent newspapers, and clothing that seemed too small for an adult. A metal box hidden under the bed contained cash, identification documents for someone named David Miller, and a bus ticket to Vancouver dated just 3 days earlier. The ID photo showed a thin man in his 40s with haunted eyes and prematurely grey hair. The notebooks contained increasingly erratic entries as the years progressed. Early entries from 1991 were relatively coherent, describing the discovery of the original cabin and the decision to keep watch over the area. The author wrote about building this second cabin as a base of operations and maintaining surveillance of anyone who visited the original site. But as the years passed, the writing became more paranoid and delusional, filled with references to government conspiracies, alien abductions, and supernatural forces. One entry from 1995 particularly caught my attention. Saw the search teams again today. They're getting closer, but they still don't understand. The family didn't disappear. They were taken somewhere else. I'm the only one who knows the truth. I have to keep the evidence safe until someone believes me. Another entry from 1999 was even more disturbing. The voices are getting louder. They want me to stop watching, to stop remembering. But I can't forget what I saw that morning. I can't let them erase what really happened. Tom Bradley helped us search the surrounding area, looking for any additional evidence or clues about who had been living in the cabin. About 50 yards from the structure, Deputy Rodriguez discovered what appeared to be a small campsite that had been abandoned years earlier. There were the remains of a tent, some rusted camping equipment, and a fire ring surrounded by stones. Most significantly, she found a metal camping plate with Sophia Borges scratched into the bottom in a child's handwriting. I spent hours studying the marked calendar, trying to understand the pattern behind the daily notations. Most days were simply marked with an X, but certain dates had additional symbols or numbers. July 4th of each year was marked with a star, as were the birthdays of each family member. The anniversary of their disappearance, June 30th, was circled in red ink every year, with increasingly elaborate notations as time passed. The 1991 entries were the most detailed and coherent. The author described arriving in the area in late June, apparently as a hiker or camper passing through the region. On June 30th, there was a lengthy entry describing the discovery of the abandoned cabin and the realization that something terrible had happened. The handwriting suggested extreme agitation. Found them this morning, all four, but they were wrong, all wrong, not where they should be, not how they should be. Someone moved them. Someone is covering this up. Subsequent entries described the author's decision to build a second cabin and maintain a vigil over the site. There were references to contact with law enforcement, though the author claimed that officials were either incompetent or actively involved in a cover-up. Told the deputy what I saw, but he wouldn't listen. Said I was confused, that the heat was getting to me. They don't want to know the truth. They're all part of it. The final entry in the most recent notebook was dated November 12, 2002, just 3 days before our discovery of the cabin. The handwriting was barely legible, but I could make out key phrases. They found me. After all these years, they finally tracked me down. I can hear them in the forest at night, getting closer. I have to run again. But first I have to make sure someone else knows the truth. I've hidden everything important. Follow the markers I left. Don't let them erase the evidence. We conducted an extensive search of the cabin and surrounding area, looking for the markers mentioned in the final entry. Deputy Rodriguez found a series of small piles of stones arranged in seemingly random locations throughout the forest. Each pile contained a rolled-up piece of paper with coordinates written in the same cramped handwriting. The coordinates led us to various locations within a 5-mile radius of the cabin, but most contained nothing more than empty holes or disturbed soil. However, one set of coordinates led us to a large Douglas fir with a distinctive lightning scar on its trunk. At the base of the tree, someone had buried a waterproof container filled with additional photographs and documents. The photos were more disturbing than anything we had found in the cabin. Close-up images of what appeared to be a crime scene, though the subjects were too decomposed to identify clearly. The documents included hand-drawn maps of the area, detailed notes about the movements of various individuals over the years, and what appeared to be a confession letter. The letter was addressed to whoever finds this and signed with the name David Miller, the same name from the identification documents we had found in the cabin. Miller claimed to have been hiking in the area in June 1991 when he discovered the bodies of the Borges family in a location several miles from their cabin. According to his account, the family had been dead for several days, and the scene suggested they had been killed elsewhere and moved to this remote location. Miller wrote that he had contacted authorities immediately, but claimed that officials had dismissed his report and refused to investigate the site he had shown them. Frustrated and suspicious, he had decided to remain in the area and document everything himself. The letter described years of surveillance, note-taking, and evidence collection, all in an attempt to expose what he believed was a massive cover-up involving local law enforcement and unknown parties. The most disturbing aspect of Miller's account was his description of returning to the site where he had found the bodies, only to discover that they had been moved again. According to his timeline, this happened sometime in early July 1991, around the time when the official search operation was beginning. Miller claimed that he watched from hiding as several men in official-looking uniforms removed all traces of the bodies and cleaned the site thoroughly. I knew I had to approach Miller's claims with extreme skepticism. His years of isolation and the increasingly paranoid tone of his writings suggested possible mental illness or delusional thinking. However, certain details in his account were disturbingly specific and seemed to contain information that hadn't been made public during the original investigation. He knew details about the family's personal belongings, their planned itinerary, and even Elena's specific camera equipment that only someone with direct knowledge could have known. The forensics team processed all the evidence we had collected, but the results were frustratingly inconclusive. The photographs were too degraded to provide definitive identification, though some elements were consistent with the clothing and personal items known to belong to the Borges family. The handwriting analysis confirmed that all the notebooks and documents had been written by the same person over a period of many years, but we had no samples of David Miller's writing for comparison. The most promising lead was the identification documents found in the cabin. David Miller's driver's license showed an address in Spokane, Washington, but when we contacted local authorities, they reported that no one by that name had lived at that address. The ID appeared to be genuine, but the person it described seemed to exist only on paper. Bank records showed minimal activity on accounts associated with the name, just enough to maintain the appearance of a normal life. I expanded the investigation to include missing persons reports from the Pacific Northwest region around the time of the Borges disappearance. Eventually, I found a case that seemed to match our mysterious witness. In August 1991, a 28-year-old man named Stephen Walsh had disappeared while hiking alone in the Mount Hood National Forest. Walsh's family had reported him missing when he failed to return from what was supposed to be a 3-day solo camping trip. Stephen Walsh's description matched the photograph on David Miller's identification, and his disappearance timeline coincided perfectly with the beginning of the journal entries we had found. Walsh had been an experienced outdoorsman and amateur photographer, which would explain his ability to survive in the wilderness for over a decade. More importantly, Walsh had a history of mental health issues, including episodes of paranoid delusions and obsessive behavior. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in a disturbing way. I theorized that Stephen Walsh had indeed discovered something related to the Borges family's disappearance, but his existing mental health problems had caused him to interpret normal law enforcement activities as evidence of a conspiracy. Over the years, his isolation and untreated mental illness had transformed a legitimate concern into an elaborate delusion system that consumed his entire life. But even this explanation left important questions unanswered. How had Walsh acquired genuine personal items belonging to the Borges family? Why did his photographs seem to show intimate moments from their final vacation? And most troubling of all, what had happened to the original crime scene that Walsh claimed to have discovered? I decided to follow Walsh's coordinates to the location where he claimed to have first found the bodies. The site was in a remote ravine about 4 miles northeast of the original cabin, in an area that had been thoroughly searched during the 1991 investigation. When I arrived with a full forensics team, we found evidence of old excavation and soil disturbance, though it was impossible to determine when the digging had occurred. Ground-penetrating radar revealed several anomalies in the soil composition, suggesting that the area had been disturbed multiple times over the years. We obtained permission to conduct a limited excavation, hoping to find some trace of what Walsh had discovered there. After 2 days of careful digging, we uncovered fragments of fabric, pieces of metal that might have been jewelry, and several bone fragments that appeared to be human. The bone fragments were sent for DNA analysis, but the results would take weeks to process. In the meantime, I continued investigating Walsh's background and trying to piece together his movements during the 11 years he had lived in the wilderness. Bank records showed that he had been withdrawing small amounts of cash from various ATMs throughout Oregon and Washington, always in towns far from his forest hideout. Store security cameras had occasionally captured images of a man matching Walsh's description, purchasing supplies in rural towns. He appeared to have maintained a careful routine of supply runs, never staying in any location long enough to attract attention. The most recent confirmed sighting was from a convenience store in Bend, Oregon, just 1 week before we discovered his cabin. I issued a statewide bulletin seeking information about Walsh's current whereabouts, though I suspected he had already fled the region. His final journal entry had suggested that he believed someone was closing in on him, and the timing of our discovery seemed to confirm his paranoia had reached a critical point. Whether his fear was justified or purely delusional remained unclear. The DNA results from the bone fragments provided a shocking confirmation of Walsh's claims. 2 of the samples matched DNA from personal items belonging to Carmen and Sofia Borges, while a third matched genetic material from their father Marcus. The evidence suggested that at least some members of the family had indeed died in the location Walsh had indicated, lending credibility to his account of finding their bodies there. This revelation forced me to reconsider the entire case from the beginning. If Walsh had been telling the truth about discovering the bodies, then someone had indeed moved them before the official investigation began. The question was whether this represented a cover-up by law enforcement, the actions of the actual perpetrator, or something else entirely. I reopened contact with Detective Morrison, who had retired but still lived in the Portland area. When I shared our findings with him, he was visibly shaken by the implications. Morrison insisted that his investigation had been conducted properly and that he had followed up on every credible lead. He had no explanation for how human remains could have been present at a location his team had searched thoroughly. Morrison did reveal one detail that hadn't been included in the official case files. During the 1991 investigation, he had received several reports of a wild man living in the forests around the cabin site. Local hunters and hikers described encounters with someone who watched them from a distance but fled when approached. Morrison had dismissed these reports as sightings of homeless individuals or survivalists who occasionally used the forest as temporary shelter. Looking back, Morrison realized that these sightings probably represented encounters with Stephen Walsh during his early months in the wilderness. The timeline matched perfectly, and the described behavior was consistent with someone trying to remain hidden while monitoring the area for suspicious activity. Morrison expressed regret that he hadn't taken these reports more seriously at the time. The investigation took on new urgency as I tried to locate Walsh and convince him to share everything he knew about the case. I contacted every social service agency, homeless shelter and mental health facility in the Pacific Northwest, hoping someone had encountered him during his years of hiding. Most had no record of anyone matching his description, but a few recalled brief interactions with a man who matched Walsh's appearance. A social worker in Eugene remembered a client who had sought emergency mental health services in 1998, claiming that he had witnessed a murder but couldn't convince anyone to believe him. The man had appeared severely malnourished and showed signs of untreated mental illness, but he had fled the facility before any meaningful treatment could be provided. The timing and details matched Walsh's story perfectly. Similar encounters had occurred sporadically over the years in various locations throughout Oregon and southern Washington. Walsh had apparently made periodic attempts to seek help or share his information with authorities, but his obvious mental health problems and increasingly bizarre claims had made it impossible for anyone to take him seriously. In December 2002, I received a call from the Vancouver Police Department reporting that a man matching Walsh's description had been found dead in a downtown hotel room. David Miller's identification was found among his possessions, along with a suicide note that apologized for failing to protect the truth and expressed hope that someone would eventually understand what had really happened to the Borges family. The note provided a final piece of Walsh's story that filled in many remaining gaps. According to his account, he had been camping illegally in the area around the Borges cabin when he heard sounds of a struggle sometime during the early morning hours of June 30th, 1991. Following the noise, he had discovered the family's bodies in the ravine, apparently killed elsewhere and dumped in this remote location. Walsh wrote that he had immediately hiked to Cedar Falls to report the discovery, but his appearance and agitated mental state had made it difficult for law enforcement to take him seriously. By the time officials agreed to accompany him back to the site several days later, the bodies had been moved. Walsh became convinced that someone was monitoring his communications with police and had removed the evidence to prevent its discovery. The note described Walsh's decision to assume a false identity and remain in the area to collect evidence and monitor the cover-up he believed was taking place. Over the years, his mental condition had deteriorated, but his commitment to documenting everything had never wavered. He had continued marking his calendar and maintaining his watch over the forest, convinced that someday someone would believe his story and bring the perpetrators to justice. Walsh's final act had been to carefully arrange all his evidence in locations where it would eventually be discovered. He had spent his last weeks in the cabin creating a trail of clues that would lead investigators to the truth, even if he couldn't deliver it himself. The marked calendar, the buried photographs, and the detailed notebooks all represented his desperate attempt to ensure that the Borges family's fate wouldn't remain hidden forever. With Walsh's death, the case took on a different character. I was no longer searching for a living witness, but trying to piece together the truth from the evidence of a deeply disturbed man who might have been the only person to witness the family's actual fate. The physical evidence supported key elements of his story, but significant questions remained about who had killed the Borges family and why their bodies had been moved multiple times. The DNA evidence from the burial site was conclusive but limited. We had confirmed that at least 3 family members had died at that location, but we had no evidence about how they had died or who was responsible. The scene had been too disturbed, and too much time had passed to recover any meaningful forensic evidence about the actual crime. I began investigating possible motives for the family's murder, focusing on anyone who might have had reason to want them dead. Marcus Borges's architectural firm had been involved in several environmental disputes over development projects, and Elena's photography work had occasionally documented illegal logging and hunting activities. However, none of these conflicts seemed serious enough to motivate mass murder. The most promising lead came from Harold Voss, the cabin's original owner. During my interview with him, Voss mentioned that the property had been the subject of a boundary dispute with a neighboring landowner in the late 1980s. The dispute had involved accusations of illegal timber harvesting and had resulted in several heated confrontations between Voss and his neighbor, a man named Clayton Reed. Reed owned several hundred acres adjacent to Voss's property and operated a small logging business that had struggled financially for several years. According to Voss, Reed had claimed that the boundary between their properties had been incorrectly surveyed and that he had legal rights to harvest timber from sections of Voss's land. The dispute had been ongoing when the Borges family disappeared and had only been resolved through expensive legal proceedings in 1993. I discovered that Clayton Reed had died in 1999, but his son Marcus Reed still lived in the area and had inherited his father's property and business. Marcus Reed agreed to meet with me, though he was obviously reluctant to discuss his father's conflicts with Harold Voss. According to the younger Reed, his father had been a difficult man who made enemies easily and had never fully accepted the legal resolution of the boundary dispute. Marcus Reed revealed that his father had maintained surveillance of Voss's property for years, convinced that Voss was planning to sell the land to developers who would restrict Reed's access to traditional hunting and logging areas. Clayton Reed had often complained about the city people who rented Voss's cabin and threatened to run them off if they interfered with his activities in the forest. The timeline was disturbing. Clayton Reed's conflicts with Voss had peaked in the spring of 1991, just weeks before the Borges family's final vacation. Marcus Reed admitted that his father had been drinking heavily during this period and had made increasingly violent threats against anyone he perceived as threatening his livelihood. The younger Reed had been away at college during the summer of 1991 and had no direct knowledge of his father's activities during that time. I obtained a warrant to search the Reed property, though I held little hope of finding evidence from a crime committed over a decade earlier. However, the search revealed a cache of weapons and ammunition that Clayton Reed had apparently hidden in a shed behind his house. Among the items was a rifle that ballistics testing later linked to poaching incidents in the area during the early 1990s. More significantly, we found several items that appeared to have belonged to the Borges family. There was a hiking boot that matched the description of equipment missing from the cabin, several pieces of camping gear that Elena had listed in her insurance inventory, and a camera lens that bore the serial number of one of Elena's professional cameras. Marcus Reed claimed to have no knowledge of how these items had come to be on his father's property. He suggested that his father might have found them in the forest during his frequent hunting trips, but couldn't explain why Clayton would have kept them hidden, rather than turning them over to authorities during the search operation. The evidence strongly suggested that Clayton Reed had been involved in the Borges family's disappearance, but with Reed dead for several years, there was no possibility of prosecution or a full confession. I was left with a collection of circumstantial evidence that painted a picture of what might have happened, but could never provide complete answers about the family's final hours. Based on all the evidence I had collected, I developed a theory about the Borges family's fate. I believe that Clayton Reed, motivated by his ongoing dispute with Harold Voss and aggravated by alcohol and financial stress, confronted the family sometime during their final days at the cabin. The confrontation escalated into violence, resulting in the death of all 4 family members. Reed then transported the bodies to the remote ravine where Stephen Walsh discovered them several days later. When Walsh reported his discovery to authorities, Reed realized that the bodies would eventually be found and properly investigated. Using his knowledge of the local terrain, Reed returned to the site and moved the remains to a location where they were less likely to be discovered. Walsh's mental health problems and agitated behavior made it easy for Reed to discredit his claims and convince law enforcement that he was an unreliable witness. Over the following years, Reed continued to monitor the situation, occasionally moving evidence when he felt it was in danger of discovery. His death in 1999 finally ended the active cover-up, but by then the trail had gone cold. This theory explains most of the physical evidence and accounts for the strange behavior of both Walsh and the missing evidence at the original crime scene. However, it leaves many questions unanswered. We never found the family's remains at their final resting place, and we have no clear understanding of exactly how the murders occurred or whether Reed acted alone. The case was officially closed in December 2003, with Clayton Reed listed as the primary suspect in the deaths of Marcus, Elena, Sophia, and Carmen Borges. Stephen Walsh was credited as a crucial witness whose mental illness had prevented him from receiving proper attention during the original investigation. The case file now runs to over 3,000 pages and includes evidence that spans 12 years of investigation. Harold Voss sold his property to the state of Oregon in 2004 and the land is now part of a protected wilderness area. A small memorial plaque marks the approximate location where the original cabin stood, though few visitors understand the tragic history associated with the site. The Borges family's story has become part of local folklore, a cautionary tale about the dangers that can lurk in even the most beautiful and seemingly peaceful places. Elena's sister Maria finally agreed to have the family declared legally dead in 2005, allowing her to settle their affairs and establish a memorial fund for missing persons investigations. She continues to visit the memorial site each year on the anniversary of their disappearance, hoping that someday the family's actual remains will be found and properly laid to rest. The case changed my approach to cold case investigations and reinforced my belief that every witness deserves to be heard, regardless of their apparent credibility. Stephen Walsh's mental illness made it easy to dismiss his claims, but his dedication to documenting the truth ultimately provided the evidence needed to solve the case. His story serves as a reminder that justice sometimes comes from the most unexpected sources. I often think about the Borges family's final vacation and imagine how different things might have been if they had chosen a different destination, or if Stephen Walsh had been able to communicate more effectively with authorities. The wilderness that had provided them with so much joy and renewal ultimately became their final resting place. Their dreams of future adventures ended by an encounter with someone whose anger and desperation drove him to unthinkable violence. The calendar that Walsh maintained for 11 years sits in an evidence box in our storage facility, a testament to one man's determination to preserve the truth, even as his mental health deteriorated. Each carefully marked day represents his commitment to ensuring that the Borges family would not be forgotten, that their story would eventually be told, and that justice would eventually be served, even if he couldn't live to see it. What happened in those Oregon woods during the summer of 1991 will never be fully understood. But thanks to Stephen Walsh's unwavering dedication and the persistence of multiple investigations, the Borges family's fate is no longer a complete mystery. They were victims of violence, not participants in their own disappearance, and their memory deserves to be honored rather than sensationalized. The truth about missing persons cases is often more complicated and disturbing than anyone wants to acknowledge. Sometimes people vanish because someone wants them to disappear, and sometimes the only witnesses are those whose credibility has been destroyed by trauma, mental illness, or circumstances beyond their control. The Borges case taught me that justice isn't always immediate or obvious, but it can still be achieved if enough people refuse to give up on finding the truth. What do you think really happened to the Borges family during those final days at the cabin? Could Stephen Walsh have prevented their deaths if someone had listened to him sooner? Share your theories in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more cold cases that will keep you awake at night.